and this is the Great War Discussion Group. Our speaker for today is Sean Ward, who, as you all know, is our one of our volunteer managers, and who we all know from that. But in his previous and considerably longer life, before he became a volunteer manager, he was a reenactor, and he has spent much of his adult life acquiring things that reenactors acquire and learning all about kilts and the Scottish uniforms and all the things that go with them. And he is going to share much of that with us today. Sean, you're on the air.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. I appreciate that. And this is more of kind of like a big old overview, because I always get a lot of questions from people that talk about kilts and where they came from and what the connection with World War I is. For those of you who don't know, over here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, I am the lead volunteer coordinator. Over here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, I wear kilts just about every day, and so I get a lot of reactions from guests, and I do an impression of a First Lieutenant 42nd Highland Black Watch when it comes to anything that's involved with the Living History program here at the museum. Now, this is kind of a nice little brief overview of a lot of different things. For the deep dives, for whatever reason, I forgot to transcribe all of the reference material, but I will get that to you, Charlie, so that we can tack that on at the end. But there's a lot more, plenty of resources that you can track down if you want to learn a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of everything. But we're going to talk a little bit about just the kilts in general, the iconic, romantic, and impractical garment of World War I. So first and foremost, we're going to talk a little bit of a brief history of kilts without getting into the weeds on too many dates and things. So the kilt itself started being worn as a garment in the late 16th century. So for all of you who are Braveheart fans, it's good to know that there were actually no kilts during the time of William Wallace, and it's just kind of a Hollywood fabrication. But we do have a lot of different historical context for the wearing of kilts. All right, so typically there were the original kilt was known as a great kilt. It consisted of around 7 yards of wool cloth that was pleated by hand and wrapped around the waist. It was secured with a belt. The ends of the fabric were then connected over the shoulder and pinned. At the time, you could actually use it as kind of a jacket or a hood just by throwing it over your shoulders or head. People often used the area above the belt as a type of extra pouch or pocket for carrying items. It was actually a very practical garment, especially for the Highland itself. Now, then it comes to the small kilt, which is very similar to what we would see in the modern day. These were basically military kilts that came around in the late 17th to 18th century. Still required about 5 to 7 yards of wool, but they dispensed with the additional fabric above the waist, making it a little easier to use with a jacket. Now, kilts in one form or another, they were worn throughout the Celtic nations. Contrary to popular belief, the Irish really did not start intentionally wearing kilts until the late 19th century. Patrick Pearse was a proponent of distinguishing Irish culture from English culture. Irish kilts were actually initially introduced, they were solid colors. You would have saffron, which was the traditional color of the Irish kings, kind of a orangish mustard brown is probably about the best way to describe it. You would also get Kelly green kilts, which of course is just your traditional color of Ireland, and navy blue kilts, just solid, which navy blue was the color of St. Patrick. Now, a lot of these were worn by school children at the time, and they were not really particularly fond of them. They got picked on a lot by the other kids in the neighborhoods and things. So it never really took off in Ireland, even though we get a lot of association of that in the United States. Now, what did catch on was the use of saffron kilts in Irish military pipe bands. And so you can actually see in World War I, you would actually have the pipers for the Irish regiments would wear the saffron kilts. but the soldiers themselves did not. So that was only something that you would see in the military pipe bands, and you still see those to this day. Now, of course, the actual design on a kilt is what's called the tartan, and that's going to be your plaid design. And this is really what kind of distinguishes the Scots from other Gaelic variants of the kilt. And it's really just that one main symbol that shows a lot of the different either clan associations or history thereof. There's a whole thing with the Sobieski Stuarts. If any of you have any questions on tartans, feel free to track me down later and I'll tell you the story of the Sobieski Stuarts who designed most of today's modern clan-oriented tartans. What we do have here, though, are some of the different regiments of Scotland that were very predominant in World War One. There were other units and divisions that, of course, had their own, but these are some of the main 12. It does include the Black Watch, Scots Greys, King's Old Scottish Borderers. There's just a complete list of all those different units. Now, one of the main things when it comes to history, you get the Battle of Culloden in the clearances. Of course, this is one of those most famous paintings from the Battle of Culloden. The Battle of Culloden happened in April 16th of 1746, kind of the end of the Jacobite Rising, and it kind of brought about the end of clan domination in Scotland. Now, this is a very deep historical topic, so you're getting just a very, very brushstroke overview on that one. Now, of course, with the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie, it brought about what came to be known as the Highland clearances. Those lasted from roughly 1750 to 1860. It was really just an attempt to eradicate Highland culture in general, and they did that in three main ways. They actually outlawed the speaking of Scots Gaelic. They outlawed wearing kilts and tartans, and outlawing the playing of bagpipes. So what you have then is kind of what do you do with these people that are just kind of hanging around? So we have what we call the other military solution. So, what do you do when you have a lot of people who live to the north, and every few generations they like to come down and kind of put the hurt on you? Well, you want to take that fighting spirit and you want to kind of put it to use in the military. Now, the English eventually raised military units from the Scottish population, and this came with several benefits. The wearing of the kilt was actually allowed in the military. This notably led to the government tartan, which is also known as the Black Watch. Bagpipes were allowed to be practiced and used in the military units. And Gaelic and certain Highland units, once they had officers of enough rank, were allowed to be spoken. And also, the pay was pretty decent when the English actually got around to paying them. Now, Scottish units served in all areas of the British Empire, all the way from the 1700s, all the way up to the Boer War, and including into World War II. Now, these are some Boer War photos. We get a lot of people who always ask about the Australian hats in some of the photos, but those are actually slouch hats that were actually used in South Africa, but they were also used by Australian soldiers. And the the kilted units in South Africa decided that a lot of times their Glengarries just did not give enough sun protection, so they would often gamble, borrow some of the hats from other people, or just outright purchase them just to get a little better sun protection. Now, right before the outbreak of World War One, there really was kind of an interesting dynamic in Scotland at the time. So prior to the war, you were either working really, really long hours in a factory in Glasgow. Glasgow was one of the major hubs for locomotive production in the United Kingdom, as well as other factories in the shipyards on the coast. Now, those were very long hours in very grueling conditions, and really the wages weren't very good. You also might wind up working with sheep or in a peat bog in the middle of nowhere, pretty much on your own. Small towns, but for those who had a sense of adventure, it was just not an area that you wanted to be stuck in. Now, also at that time, you had a lot of unemployment. in throughout Scotland, and the population in itself was relatively poor. So during early recruitment drives, you would actually see a lot of the jobless men being encouraged to sign up first, or men with jobs being pushed to the back of the line to make sure that those without jobs actually were able to sign up for the military. So the prospect of adventure and the opportunity to escape from poverty, dreary surroundings, or a tedious job played their part in drawing men to the recruiting office. This was a quote from Peter Simpkins in his book about General Haig. And at least on this chart over here, you can see where a lot of the major recruiting was done for the primary regiments within the Scottish military, within the British military, with the Scottish regiments. We're going to talk a little bit about wools, dyes, and some labor. Now, wool production was seized by the government in 1915 in order to ensure supplies for uniform production. Almost all the uniforms at that time were made of wool, with cotton only being used in the hottest of climates. The idea of seizing the wool production was just trying to make sure that there were plenty of uniforms available for the men, although the British quickly ran out of wool and had to import it from other countries. Now, wool itself can keep you pretty warm. It's naturally water repellent, very durable material, and wool production continued throughout the war, but it quickly became in short supply as things began to drag on. Now, dyes are one of the things that was very interesting. Many of the dyes that were used for kilts were previously produced in Germany. So when the dyes ran out, the British either tried to make their own with mixed success, or they were able to import them from the US and Canada. So a lot of the dyes that you would see kind of brought in would have to be shipped in. Now, it takes a lot of labor in order to make a kilt. In fact, one kilt can take up to 2 days to make a single one, and many units waited weeks or even months before getting their kilts. Now, they were instead issued with an assortment of kind of leftover and mothballed uniforms. Some of them actually jokingly refer to themselves as the Salvation Army, just because they had all of the hand-me-down jackets and pants and hats that were kind of mothballed by the government. Now, one little fun little side story here. There was an economic historian. Her name is Dr. Helen Paul, and she found a note in a family heirloom kilt from World War One. The kilt was actually made for the London Scottish Regiment and still in its original packing material. So it was never worn and it was never used in the war. But when she actually took it out, she found a note that was sewn into the basting stitches. And the basting stitches are the ones that are used at the base of the kilt on the bottom in order to hold the pleats in place whenever they're going through shipping and whenever they're laying the pleats initially. And it was actually a note. It said, "I hope your kilt will fit you well, and in it you will look a swell. If married, never mind. If single, drop a line. Wish you bags of luck and a speedy return back to Blighty." And then her name was Helen Govan of 49 Ardgowan Street, Glasgow. Hope I pronounced that right. But it was just a really neat, touching little note of someone who was just reaching out to a soldier and hoping to hear something back. So, very quaint thing. I don't know how many of those she sewed into those kilts, but I know that at the time, Dr. Helen Paul was actually trying to find and track down some of the relatives of the lady who sewed that in. Now, one of the prominent things we're going to talk about is, you know what? It says 1917. It should be 1915. That's my bad. It's 1915 in the Battle of Loos. So the Battle of Loos was actually the largest gathering of kilted soldiers in history, with over 36,000 kilties from multiple countries participating. Now, this is, here we go. Now, it was also the first time that poison gas was used by the British. And at the time, they did not use shells to deliver gas, but they would actually have large canisters and hoses. And what you would do is you would actually try to push or run out the hoses as far as you could out into no man's land, wait for the wind to get just the right direction, and then open all the tanks. Well, the problem was that prior to the battle, the British forces were actually under a heavy bombardment. And when the gas was eventually released, the wind shifted direction and blew it all right back into the trenches. So at that time, you had a lot of confusion, a lot of things that were going wrong. Everyone was kind of hunkered down in the trenches. The trenches were filling with gas. And at that point in time, you see the gentleman up above here, whose name was Daniel Laidlaw. Now, Daniel Laidlaw was part of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. He was actually awarded the Victoria Cross. When the attack bogged down, he actually jumped up and started to march along the ridge of the trench line and playing the All the Blue Bonnets Are Over the Border, which was the rally song and actually the charge song for multiple units in World War One. So we have a wonderful little painting of Daniel Laidlaw and then a photo of him later in his life. He was actually awarded the Victoria Cross, only one of two pipers in World War One to win the Victoria Cross, and he was actually wounded 5 times during the Battle of Loos. So the Black Watch itself actually was going to wind up losing 9 out of 13 officers in the first 3 days of combat. And when they started to actually capture German soldiers and they would bring them in for questioning, they would ask them, hey, why are you shooting all of our officers? And the Germans, of course, were very matter of fact. They said, well, you guys have a tendency to wave your swords in the air, and you just happen to have your rank on the cuff of your sleeve. And you're blowing those whistles. So, the Germans just really kind of could identify very quickly who the officers were. And so at the end of 1915, all officers would be ordered to send their swords home. At that point in time, that would be one of the items that all officers were required to carry. And you can actually see in the slide here on the left, you actually see a very interesting handle. It is just a crossguard, a very basic crossguard. So it uses the same pattern sword that you would see with the English infantry officer sword of the time, and even the basket hilt Scottish claymore, which you'll see throughout the slide presentation. But this particular cross-hilted sword is one that would be used, but not used very often. Now, one of the other things that would be required at the end of 1915 is the use of helmets on the front lines. A lot of the Scottish units were very resistant to the idea of the helmets, but it actually, they kind of preferred their tam o'shanters and their Glengarrys at the time. But eventually they came to realize that the helmets were going to be a much safer alternative to what they had been doing. So we're going to get a little bit into kilt production and design. So you're going to see a variety of different ways of pleating the kilt, and you're going to see the things that can be pleated to the set. When you actually pleat a kilt to the set, the idea is that when you do the pleating in the back of the kilt, that the general pattern of the kilt is repeated in the back, so that even though you have the different folds in the kilt, the pattern itself is repeated on the back. Now, you can also get pleated to the stripe, where you find a dominant stripe on the back of the kilt, and that is repeated over and over again. And you wind up with, sorry about that, you wind up with those white lines like you see in the front. You can also have you pleated the set, pleated the stripe. There's also box pleating, which is actually a different type of pleating, and we'll look at that here in just a second. There we go. So we have traditional box pleating. This would have been used throughout the Highlands. It actually uses a different amount of wool, sometimes a lot less than traditional knife pleating. And so you will see that used often, especially later in the war when they're trying to mass produce and they're trying to save money on wool. You're actually also going to see the traditional knife pleating. That's just the general side pleating, and the military box pleating, which is a much more complex design. That would have been reserved for officers at the time and not something that an enlisted soldier would normally wear. Kind of a good way to look at some of the differences on this is going to be the different types of pleating. Now, even though some people will say that there's a military style of pleating, or that pleating to the line is actually the military and pleating to the set is not, actually, they were found in mixed varieties. So you would often see both types of pleating in a single unit. It really just depended on when it was made and where it was made at the time. And you can see here the same kilt, just with those two different types of pleating. Now, also, you can see we have 3 buckles on the kilt as a way to fasten the kilt around the waist. Now, military kilts normally are going to be at least above the navel. Some of them were high enough to be just underneath the rib cage. So you had a great deal amount of wool that was going to be wrapped around your torso. That was very good because it kept you warm in your midsection, and just kind of, I don't know, it's just very interesting that some of the kilts that you see the men wearing without the jackets almost cover their entire torso. Now we have the 3 buckle kilts. You would also see simple ties on occasion where the belt buckle straps themselves would break off, and soldiers in the field would just take any cloth that they could find, sew that on there, and just create simple ties. Sometimes they were actually manufactured with cloth straps instead of leather, especially once some of the supplies became a little lower. And sometimes you would even see soldiers resorting to using bracers, where they would just sew in buttons and just used bracers instead to try to keep their kilts up. Now, there are some different pros and cons when it comes to wearing kilts. So, one of the pros is definitely freedom of movement. That includes restroom breaks, but it was actually very easy to run, jump, cross different barriers. Kilts are very, very handy. Now, in a lot of these pictures, you'll also see kilt aprons being worn. The kilt apron is a khaki cotton material that was normally used to wrap around the kilt. Some kilt aprons were only in the front, leaving the pleats open in the back. Some of the other ones went completely around with pleats in the back themselves. They would usually tie off on the side. And the kilt apron was there to, number one, help keep the kilt clean, but it could also be used as camouflage, as some of the kilts were rather brightly colored. The last thing you wanted to do was draw a lot of attention to your midsection when it came to a firefight. So they also had a small pocket sewn in front, which kind of doubled as your sporran. And that was really handy for just carrying personal items, maps, and things of those nature. Now, one of the nice things about kilt aprons is when the weather got too hot, you would actually see some of the soldiers, especially in Gallipoli, they would actually remove their kilts and wear just the kilt apron. Also, if they were crossing a river, a lot of times a soldier would actually remove his kilt, roll it up, wear the kilt apron to wade through the water, and then carry the kilt itself over their shoulder. It was just an easier way to get across some of those deeper rivers and keeps your kilt from getting too waterlogged. So as I mentioned, kilts were actually rather tolerable in warm weather. You had a little bit of ventilation underneath there, and they were actually used throughout the different areas of the world. Now, in the deserts, it was particularly interesting because where you had that breathability with the garment, at the same time, all the wool wrapped around your midsection helped keep you warm at night, especially when the temperatures would plunge. So, airflow, as we were just talking about, is actually very important, also for your health and comfort. So, it was easier to use, very comfortable, and it was very healthy. A lot of times, soldiers would wear their uniforms for long periods of time and have different health issues associated with moisture buildup and chafing. Not something that you would normally get with a kilt. And of course, the ever popular esprit de corps. A lot of pride was shown by many of the troops in their kilts. In fact, it was one of the things that a lot of the commanding officers pointed out, is that they wanted that esprit de corps in order to motivate their soldiers. And it turned out that it was actually one of the main driving forces in recruitment. During recruitment, you always had a large number of Scottish soldiers who volunteered not only to get out of bad situations, but also for the very romanticized aspects of the military at the time. And so there was a lot of, um, I don't know, just a lot of pride involved in that. And when you would get later on in the war, when they would actually try to get rid of kilts because of the high production value, because the amount of wool that they took, the dyes, the labor, everything else, when they tried to cut back on that, they had a huge dip in recruitment. And so they were actually kind of forced to bring back the kilts in a lot of these areas in order for recruitment numbers to stay steady. All right. So some of the cons that we do have with the kilt are going to be cold weather. Now, a kilt is very nice because when you're walking and you're moving, you're circulating, you're building up warm air. That warm air does get trapped underneath the kilt. It helps keep you warm. I often have people ask me in the middle of winter how I can, stand to wear a kilt. And the idea is that when you're moving around, kilts are actually very warm and very comfortable. The problem is when you're sitting in a trench. When you're sitting in a trench, you're no longer moving. You do not get the normal circulation. So, one of the big problems that you would have would be frostbite on the knees. And you can actually see some of the gentlemen here displaying a few ways that this was countered. One way was actually by wearing pants. The gentleman on the right is actually wearing a pair of trousers underneath his kilt. Some people, like the gentleman on the left in the front, actually would just pull their hose or their socks up over their knee. Traditionally, you'd have longer socks that you would then fold over, held up with a garter. But by pulling those all the way up, you can actually kind of keep your knees a bit warmer. Also, one of the problems that they had in the trenches is if your kilt did happen to get waterlogged in the winter, your kilt would freeze. And the pleats in the back, when you walked, would actually freeze and would cut the back of your knees as you were walking. So it was a very interesting predicament to be in. There were some units that would actually send their kilts back in the fall and then have them shipped back home in the spring. This wasn't always feasible. So a lot of times the soldiers were just kind of left to their own devices. Yes, it's our friends, the lice and the midges and all those little bugs that bothered everybody so much. It just so turns out that all those little pleats in a kilt were just perfect for lice. It's one of those things that was very prominent throughout trench warfare, and those things just would bother people to no end. There's even reports of soldiers who came home after the end of the war who would basically just take their kilts, hang them in the basement or in a cellar, and they would have to wait a year or more for all of the lice to eventually die. It was just almost impossible to get rid of the lice inside of a kilt. All right. Also, along with the lice and other bugs, one of the cons was disease and exposed skin. There was actually a couple different units that were operating in Africa during World War One that had 110% casualty rates, based particularly upon the amount of exposed skin and diseases that were transferred by insect bites. Insects became a huge nuisance, especially in the African territories, and actually caused most of the casualties and most of the hospitalizations in that area. So, definitely one of the negatives. And probably about the worst thing that you're going to come across is going to be mustard gas. With chemical weapons, eventually it led to mustard gas. And the problem with mustard gas was the fact that it was a skin contact agent that actually caused blistering and extreme burns on exposed skin. And unfortunately, when it came to kilts, you had a lot of exposed skin underneath a kilt. So these are just a couple of pictures of some victims from mustard gas, including the deceased fellow on the left, who was a Scottish Highlander, just kind of showing some of the blistering effects that came with that. You could also see the doctor and nurse trying to help another soldier The problem with mustard gas, of course, is it would seep into the ground. It would last for weeks in the soil. Initially, you would just have a slight itching, which would go to a burning and then eventually blistering. It was a very, very difficult thing to deal with as a Highland unit. So, some of the solutions that they did try to come up with for mustard gas would be long, kind of rubberized boots. The idea was to wear those large boots in order to reduce the amount of skin that was exposed. Some units would actually wear bloomers, which were based on the women's bloomers of the day. And the idea was to kind of keep your private areas a little bit more covered and less susceptible to the mustard gas. It was kind of an ongoing problem, and you can see the soldiers would come up with just about any solution that they could, including, much like they did in winter, wearing pants underneath their kilts. However, it really was the introduction of mustard gas that kind of made it the practical end of the kilt as a military garment. Plus, when you actually wound up with more contemporary fabrics as you get further into the future, the kilt itself just became less and less viable as a uniform. So we're throwing just a little bit of bonus material here at the tail end of everything. One of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm, he was related to the English royal family, did wear a kilt. You can see he has his emotional support badger sporran, but this is a picture of him in his younger days, which is always kind of a fun one. For those of you who remember, we did have Walt Disney, who was in the military in World War I as well, and have a nice little one of Goofy as the pipe sergeant. And last but not least, for all of you movie buffs, after the war, the London Scots, they actually gained the nickname the Hollywood Battalion, basically because the fighting unit in World War I included the famous Hollywood actors Basil Rathbone, Ronald Colman, Claude Rains, a personal favorite of mine, and Herbert Marshall. And that's really it. Hopefully, you got a little bit of understanding of kind of how the kilts were used, some of the pros and cons, some of the different elements that made it a very kind of iconic garment of World War I. You would find some kilts in World War II, but not nearly as many, and mostly just with pipe bands. Now that the British military itself has kind of shrunk in a lot of ways, a lot of the different units have been amalgamated. But it really just is kind of a neat little window into the history, not only of Scotland, but also of Canada, South Africa, all the other countries that were a part of World War I and supplied the British Armed Forces with kilted units. And that is that. I'll try to answer a couple different questions if I can, and we'll go from there.
Well, Shane, thank you very much. That was a good overview, and I think the kilt as a military garment may be gone, but I can testify to the continuing appeal of the bagpipe. Many American military units will have one or two bagpipers among them who are dragged out on ceremonial occasions to play what is loosely called music during the marching and the ceremonies. I think it's a real tribute to the enduring legacy of the Scots soldiers that would be true.
Yeah, we actually have the SAMs, which are the Scottish American Military Society. They're actually a group of veterans who wear kilts, and they have the different kilts for the different various American armed forces. And we get them showing up here at the museum, and once every couple of years, they'll usually make an appearance, which is always kind of fun.
And we'll see everybody either at the museum or on this call on May 19th.